Hello, I'm Mark Payne with the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. The Humanities Council makes these characters available at no cost to nonprofit organizations across West Virginia, such as schools, libraries, historical societies, and a wide range of civic groups. History Alive is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. We encourage your organization or school to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Robert E. Lee or Ann Bailey come to speak to your group can really breathe life into these important people from history and make them seem more real. Nothing compares to the live in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. The 15 presenters on our History Alive roster have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their characters. A History Alive presentation is not a play. It is very much an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is both fun and educational. It's difficult to reproduce here in the studio the feel of an actual History Alive presentation. Without an audience to ask questions, we have to depart from the usual format, and that means our guests will sit with me and answer a few questions interview style, rather than taking questions from the audience. But we hope to give you a sample of how a History Alive presentation can add to the offerings at your school or organization. There will be information on your screen at the end of this program about how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Alive character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are fortunate to have with us Pearl S. Buck.
The dragon is an important figure in Chinese mythology. To a Chinese person, a dragon is not an evil creature, but a god, and a friend to those who worship him. I was born June 26th, 1892, in the year of the dragon. It is important to me that I was born in West Virginia, the land of my ancestors, for it means I am West Virginian by birth as well as ancestral heritage. It is equally important to me that I was taken to China when I was only 3 months old by my missionary parents, for it means that my home was West Virginia, but my environment was Chinese. In this atmosphere so delicately and yet so profoundly poised between East and West, I grew to maturity. I often found myself explaining Westerners to Asians and Asians to Westerners. Oh, this was not difficult, for I belonged, and still do belong equally, to both cultures. As I said, I was taken to China when I was only 3 months old by my missionary parents. I came to speak Chinese before I spoke English. I came to love the Chinese people as my own people. But make no mistake about it, the Chinese people loved me, but they made no bones about the fact that my blue eyes were not a proper color. And my hair, which was yellow when I was a child, was considered most unlucky. In fact, my nanny, Wang Ama, made a cap to cover up the unfortunate color of my hair. And just in case, she embroidered a little Buddha on the front, in case that Christian god should shirk his duty. But I think it was this bicultural existence that brought me to understand racism, as few white people in America can truly understand it. For I know what it's like to be treated differently because of the color of one's skin. And I will fight all my life to end race prejudice whenever and wherever I can. In fact, Langston Hughes calls me the Harriet Beecher Stowe of the 20th century. And Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, said that only 2 white women in America, 2 white people in America, in fact, understood the American Negro dilemma. And that was my good friend, Eleanor Roosevelt, and myself. But I think the bicultural existence that I lived living between two worlds, also brought me to be a writer. For writing gives you the closest relationship to people. And aren't people the most important thing in this world? The first book I ever wrote, I would say almost was by accident. I never intended for it to be published. I'd written a book about my mother, for she had passed away, and I longed to keep her memory alive. Of course, years later, it was published under the title of The Exile. And then my public called for another book about my father, and I published that one and called it Fighting Angel. And it was these two books about my missionary West Virginia parents that were cited when I received my Nobel Prize for Literature. And I'm glad I could take a piece of West Virginia with me to Sweden when I went to get that award. Oh, I've always considered myself to be a West Virginian, for I was born here and my ancestors were born here. You see, in China, it doesn't matter where you are living, but where you are born and where your people are from. From there you take your citizenship and your nationality. So I have always considered myself to be a West Virginian, for I was born here and my people were born here. If I had given a choice of the place of my birth, I would have chosen right where I was born, in my grandfather's large white house, set with the beautiful mountains of Pocahontas County behind it. My mother had grown up there, but she longed to become a missionary to foreign lands, and she met a young man who shared her dream. Of course, that was Absalom Seidenstricker, my father. My father was a Presbyterian minister, and he had come to Hillsborough to visit his brother, who was also a Presbyterian minister. In fact, there were 7 boys in that family, and 6 were ministers. Well, 5 were Presbyterian, and 1, in the wildness of his youth, became a Methodist. But my mother and father realized they shared a dream, and they set off to be missionaries to China. And my mother came early to see the land of China for what it was and is to this day, a country of great contradiction, where the most beautiful in the world is inextricably bound with the saddest. My mother's attraction to China would bind her most strangely at times, for she too experienced great joy and great sorrow. She gave birth to 7 children, 4 of which died from the lack of medical resources available in the remote part of the world they lived. 3 died before I was even born. She was home on her furlough, the first furlough of her missionary career, when she realized she was pregnant with me and insisted upon staying in West Virginia, where she would be near the medical resources she realized she desperately needed. But as I said, I was 3 months old when we went back. So it was China that I knew as a child. China, a land of age-old nuances and limitless possibilities. China. There was so much about China I remember with fondness as a child. So many people that were truly important to me. I've already told you about Wang Ma. It was she who told me stories and songs of Chinese mythology. And today, I consider myself to be nothing more than a Chinese storyteller. And I credit Wang Ma with that gift. Mr. Kung was also important. He was my tutor and a Confucius scholar. He taught me a way of looking at the world that I have carried with me to this day. So you see, I had a very unusual upbringing. I had a Buddhist nanny, Confucius teacher, and Presbyterian parents. It's no wonder I became a writer. What do you do with that? But there was another China that I knew growing up. It was a China that was disturbed politically. For many generations, China had been dominated by the English and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the French, and it wanted its own nation back. Can you blame them? Even in their own nation, Chinese people were treated as second-class citizens by these white businessmen. And even those of us who loved the Chinese people and respected their culture could feel this growing distrust and resentment. When I was 9 years old, the Boxer Rebellion erupted, and my mother and I had to flee for our lives to Shanghai. But the revolution that would rock China did not come at that time, and peace covered China like a thin sheet of ice beneath which a river boiled. It wasn't until years later, when I was an adult with children of my own, the revolution finally came. I had a harrowing experience, almost losing my life when the Chinese army attacked Nanjing, where I lived, with the intent of killing all of the white people they found. I think it was that close brush with death that intensified my desire to write. I poured all of my thoughts and feelings into a book that I called Wang Lung. Today you call it The Good Earth. The Good Earth was an instant success, astonishing me beyond words. It was a best-selling book of 1931, 32, and 33. It won the Howells Medal, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and Will Rogers said it was the best book ever written, which didn't hurt sales, I might add. Now, many people think that I won the Nobel Prize for The Good Earth, but indeed, the two books that were cited were the books I told you about my West Virginia missionary parents. And in fact, the Academy said that I won the prize for the body of her work, as they said. And bookstores were besieged the next day with requests for Pearl Buck's new book, The Body of Her Work. I did receive a great deal of accolade for the Nobel Prize, for in fact, in my lifetime, I was the only woman to receive both the Pulitzer and the Nobel. But I also received a great deal of criticism. People said that my work was unimportant because I was a woman. They said that I wrote for women and therefore my work was unimportant. They said Theodore Dreiser should have won the prize. Indeed, Theodore Dreiser called me and told me he should have won the prize. Be careful when you become famous, for you will be attacked. The Academy did not take into account simply the fact of my writing, but also the active humanitarian causes I was involved in. I was actively anti-war. I spoke out against Hitler and Mussolini. I spoke out against the Japanese aggression in China and raised funds for medical relief. I spoke out to free India from England and to free the Japanese Americans interned in concentration camps. And I spoke out for women's rights and for racial injustice, to end that wherever possible. My friends, the shadow of racism is over all of us, but it is darkest over those of us who allow its evil influence to continue. Now, I know there are people in whom racism is ingrained, and if that is so, we must not allow those people to violate our nation's democracy. A truly democratic nation must ensure that all people are free, that they have freedom, not merely freedom from want, not merely freedom from fear, but the great freedom to be free. I would fight, I would die, I would go to prison for you, for me, for everyone. It is my only creed. Of course, my views on racial integration and ending race prejudice brought me a great deal of criticism from people such as Senator McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover. But still, my influence was heard in that regard. And my sphere of influence went even further. Perhaps I am most known for my work for children's causes. Oh, I grieved that I could not have many children of my own. And so I poured myself into helping children around the world. And today, the Pearl S. Buck Foundation has helped over 100,000 children worldwide. And I can do this good work because my voice is heard. I have written over 100 novels, over 200 articles, over 100 children's stories and short stories, and produced 16 films. And my work is published into 60 different languages, more than any other writer in my day. I can do my work and be successful at it because I love my work. I can only say to those of you who are thinking about what to do with your life, search your hearts and your minds for your talents and your abilities, and devise a way of making a living out of doing what you love to do. Think about what you really like and make a career out of that thing. And if you can do that, you'll never be bored. You'll never be cynical. You'll never be rebellious. Every morning will be a joy, and you shall live in peace with yourself.
We're back with Miss Pearl Buck, and Miss Buck has agreed to answer just a few questions from us today. So first off, I'd like to welcome you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Payne.
To being on the program, and to thank you for taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to be here. I just wanted to ask you, how often do you come back to West Virginia?
Well, I don't come back as often as I'd like. Of course, my family home fell out of my family hands a while back in Hillsborough. However, women's clubs of West Virginia and my good friend, Jim Comstock, have undertaken a project to renovate that house. And I've come back on several occasions to help them raise money for that. And so I've been here a couple of times in the past few years, and it's been a delight to be back here. I'm not here very much. People often ask why I didn't move here. But you see, I own the publishing company. My husband, Richard Walsh, and I have bought the John Day Publishing Company. We live, that's in New York City. I'm on a number of important committees in Washington. And my daughter is in a school in New Jersey, so we choose to live outside of Philadelphia because that is the most central place for those commitments.
I see. I heard you say in your talk earlier that you very much consider yourself a West Virginian.
Oh, absolutely.
And we are very proud of the fact that you consider yourself a West Virginian. I just wanted to ask you, what are some of your memories of the state of West Virginia?
I lived here the year I was 10 years old. That was the year following the Boxer Rebellion. We came home for the second furlough of my mother's missionary career. And I remember it so clearly, for I went to school there and I played with the children. I sat on my grandfather's front porch and pulled grapes from that front porch and read my beloved Charles Dickens books. My cousin was going to get confirmed in the Old Stone Church in Lewisburg, and I found out she was going to get a new dress. Well, I told my father I too wished to be confirmed, for he thought I desired righteousness. He didn't know I desired a new dress. But Mr. Payne, I'll tell you what I remember the clearest. I was 10 years old, and I had never seen another white child. We lived in a very rural part of China. Every person I had met before had black hair and brown eyes. Now, I had a brother, Clyde, who died when I was 6. I had my older brother, Edgar, was 13 years older than I. When I was 3 years old, he came home to America to school, and Clyde was 6 when he died. No, I'm sorry, I was 6 when Clyde died, and my sister Grace was just an infant. So I had never seen another child with blonde hair and blue eyes until I was 10 years old. That was my clearest recollection of my home in West Virginia.
Do you remember what your reaction was?
It's a very liberating feeling to realize you're not alone in the world, to realize that you are not completely different from everyone else. And I think I went back more empowered, I would say.
You know, in many ways, I guess you have always been a liaison to the Western world as far as interpreting Chinese and Asian culture. I'd be interested to know what you think some of the ways have been that you've actually done that.
It was very interesting to me. When I came to America in 1932, now The Good Earth was already a bestseller by this point, I found out that no one in America knew anything about Asian culture whatsoever. It was as if I became a spokesperson for an entire culture of people. In fact, in 1939, right before we entered World War II, the American government took a survey of people of America, asking them what they knew about China. 90% of Americans only knew about China from what they had read in Pearl Buck's books. So I truly became, in many ways, the definitive committee member for our Chinese representation. I was on the East. My husband and I founded the East-West Association. I was in a number of important organizations. We were part of the Asia Magazine board. I was on the India League. I was one of the leading proponents of freeing India from British colonial rule, and I was in a number of organizations talking about Chinese culture. I also served as an advisor to the American government. In fact, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, we suddenly found ourselves allies with China, for they had been at war with China for the past 9 years. And President Roosevelt asked me to come to the White House to advise a group of people on how to deal with China being our allies. Among these was Wild Bill Donovan, who is the founder of the OSS, which became the CIA. So in essence, the CIA knew nothing about China, and I helped them understand this culture better. And when Mrs. Roosevelt was going to visit China in 1942, it was I they turned to for advice on how she should act and speak and what she should do in China.
Did you feel comfortable in that role?
Absolutely. I could represent Chinese people. They are the people of my heart as well. And I absolutely felt comfortable in that role.
Yeah, well, you spent the first half of, or a large portion of the early years.
I didn't move home to America until I was in my 40s. Mm-hmm.
Well, what was it that you found, if anything? What surprised you about the culture and America after living for a while in China?
What surprised me the most was I knew nothing about America. I did come home to college for 4 years when at Randolph-Macon Women's College. But again, a college is a little bit selected society of people. You would stay with the same people. But mostly, what I knew about America was what my mother had taught me as a child. It was the land of the free and the home of the brave. And I was appalled, frankly, Mr. Payne, at the outrageous racism that occurred, the lynching in the South, the way the Native American people were treated. I was appalled at women's role in society. I thought it was medieval. I thought even in China, which is admittedly repressive, that finally in 1911, after Sun Yat-sen led the rebellion and women began to take positions of importance, women became bankers, for who better knows how to manage money than a woman who's run a household? Women became doctors. Who better knows a woman's body than another woman? But in America, a land of the free, women couldn't be bankers. They couldn't be doctors. And I was appalled at the limitations that supposedly a democratic society was putting on so many members of its own population.
Well, you certainly didn't let those limitations restrict
no, I spoke
your
out
activities.
as much as I could and as often as I could.
And in terms of speaking out, I know you were one of the very first celebrities to really speak out about mental retardation, and I'd like to ask you if you could share with us just a little bit your experience with
Certainly.
With that.
My birth daughter, Carol, was retarded at birth. She has PKU syndrome. Of course, for many years I refused to acknowledge that anything was wrong. It's a monstrous journey that a parent of a retarded child begins upon. It permeates your bones and muscles, this ache of the heart. And I was determined to find a cure for Carol. I never did, of course, because PKU syndrome is irreversible. And finally, when Carol was 6 years old, a doctor sat me down and told me that I must give up hope, that my daughter would never be normal. She would never be older mentally than 6 years old. He said to me, she will never read the books you write. Now, I want to tell you that I love my daughter with all my heart. She has extraordinary integrity. She has great joy in her heart. And I realize that the mind is not all that makes up a person. But because of Carol, I have dedicated myself to helping retarded children. And actually, when my sister Grace was in the hospital giving birth to a child, a nurse came to see her and told her that because of the work that I had funded, PKU syndrome has been effectively eradicated in America. It is an enzyme deficiency that a child is born with, but it can be found at birth. I'm sure you've heard the diaper test. That is what the PKU syndrome looks to change. And so, because of my work, we have ended one important cause of mental retardation. But also, I spoke out about this. In 1950, I wrote a book called The Child That Never Grew, and about my daughter Carol and the feelings I had being the parent of a retarded child. And I received thousands upon thousands of letters from other people who had said they understood this. They were so glad I finally spoke out, because before that, you never acknowledged you had a retarded child. In fact, you would put them away in an institution and forget about them. But I would not allow that to happen. And I found an organization that agreed with me. It was Vineland Institute, and that's where Carol lives today. It's a very progressive organization.
And your foundation continues to do good
help.
work.
The Pearl S. Buck Foundation does address some issues of mentally retardation. Now, the Pearl S. Buck Foundation primarily deals with children of Amerasian. I coined the phrase Amerasian parents, children who have been forgotten in Asia by American servicemen, fathered children in Asia. And you see in Asia, a culture that values purity above all else. They find that children of mixed racial parentage to be a lower class, and they are forgotten, they are left homeless, they are starved, they are often tortured. And so the Pearl S. Buck Foundation has created hospitals and orphanages to help children of Amerasian descent.
I'd like to shift gears here just for a second, and I know that you had a conflict with a noted publisher
I did.
in the United States, Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Look and Life magazines. And would you share with us just a little bit about what that was all about?
Certainly. Mr. Luce also lived as a missionary as a child in China. And he was very much a leading proponent and a dear friend of Chiang Kai-shek. Now, Chiang Kai-shek was supposedly purported to be the democratic leader of China. I knew Chiang Kai-shek personally, and Madam Chiang. And I knew that Chiang Kai-shek was a military dictator. He was no more democratic than anyone else, than Mao Zedong, I believe. And I knew that Chiang was corrupt. I knew that he was given ammunition and guns from America and would turn around and sell them to the communists. And I knew furthermore that he could not ultimately be successful in China. During World War II, I did not speak out against Chiang Kai-shek, for he was our ally. But after the war was over, and civil war broke out immediately, within a week of the bombing of Japan, civil war broke out between the nationalists and the communists. I knew that ultimately Mao Zedong would be successful with the communists because the communists treated the Chinese peasants with respect that they had never before received. And so I knew that while I did not agree with communism, I am not communist, Mr. Payne. There is not a drop of communist blood in my body, but I was certain that Mao Zedong would be successful, which he was. And I was certain that if we did not keep the lines of communication open with him, the bamboo curtain would fall as the Iron Curtain had fallen before, and it would pave the way for a Cold War and eventually conflict in Korea and as we know as well now Vietnam. And so I saw these things coming. It was so frustrating to me. But Henry Luce would not listen to reason. He simply felt that Chiang Kai-shek was the answer. And he actually wrote a very famous memo that said that nothing good about Pearl S. Buck may ever be written in Look or Life magazine. So he perceived me to be his dreaded enemy. I don't perceive him that way at all, but that's how he perceived me.
Oh, okay, I see. At this point, I would like to welcome to the program the presenter of Pearl Buck.
Right.
This is Karen Varanch of Fayetteville. And Karen is one of the presenters on the History Alive roster of historical characters. And I know, Karen, you have been doing Pearl Buck for several years, and you do many characters. What are some of the other characters?
I do. I have 9 shows in repertoire altogether. In addition to Pearl in the History Alive style, I do Mother Jones, the labor organizer, Mary Draper Ingalls, who was captured by Indians, Emma Edmund Seeley, who served as a soldier in the Union Army, disguised herself as a man, and Clara Barton. So, and then in addition, I have a play about life in the coal fields, a play about women in World War II, and I am a storyteller.
So you're a busy lady.
Yes.
And I know you've been certainly involved with the History Live program for several years.
Since its inception in '89.
Yeah, and we're very proud. We're really lucky. Maybe lucky isn't the word, but we try to take care of business, and we're so pleased that we have so many talented people such as yourself that are involved in History Alive. But I wanted to, I know that you travel all over the country.
I do.
And all over the world, actually, in doing these things. And I know you were in China last year. In the last minute or so that we've got here remaining, if you could share with us a little bit about your experience in China and how that may be related to your work as Pearl
I had a
Buck.
wonderful opportunity, Mark. The Chinese government invited 34 American storytellers. There was a storytelling village in the North China Plains called Genshun. And Genshun is, in many villages in China, they dedicate themselves to one art, calligraphy or painting or weaving. But this village was a storytelling village. And so I joined 33 other American storytellers and told stories there. Now, I don't know if it exactly was a village Pearl was in, but Pearl wrote The Good Earth about the North China Plains. It was a fabulous experience.
Oh, that's great. And I know you had a blast, and I was lucky to have a chance to talk with you a little bit about what and you're going to England here this week.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'll tell you what, Karen, I really want to thank you for coming here and doing this program today. And I want to remind folks that History Alive characters are available to come to your school or your organization, your community for fairs or festivals and things like that. And it's a great program. These folks do a wonderful job. And so again, thanks to Karen Varanch as Pearl Buck. And I want to remind you folks that the West Virginia Library Television Network is helping to keep you informed. Thanks for watching History Alive.